Hello everyone. If you're watching this, you are either a student currently or have been one at some point in your life. And I'm confident that at one time or another, you have definitely felt disappointed or frustrated, or at the very least, sleepy while listening to a classroom lecture. Perhaps you have tried to give voice to your feelings, only to be shot down by questions like, why can't you be more focused in class? Why can't you be more attentive? Why can't you be more serious with your studies? And those types of questions may have left you feeling even more frustrated. But what if we're asking all the wrong questions? What if we are pointing our questions in the wrong direction? Perhaps instead of the students, we should be asking questions to the people who actually do the teaching, that is, the teachers and the professors, the college professors. Perhaps rethink, reevaluate, and look into the actual research that has been done to transform teaching from a mere tool to cover the syllabus to something that can actually help the students learn. And in this video, we are going to do exactly that through a conversation with Professor Richard Felder, a Professor Emeritus of Chemical Engineering in the North Carolina State University, United States. Professor Felder is a pioneering figure in the field of research on education, on engineering education specifically, and he has also been a long-time practitioner of what he preaches through a unique teaching style that centers on students' learning. Accountants, psychologists, and physicians who undergo years and years of supervised training before being actually allowed to practice on their own, but not college professors.
If I put everything on PowerPoint slides and flash them like this during the class, and I'll cover the book, will they learn anything? No. The only way people learn in a meaningful way is by doing things. When students are taught in this manner, they learn more, they learn at a deeper level, and they get higher grades on the examinations. And if you do this, I'll give you a guarantee. Your teaching is just going to start getting better.
To many of you in chemical engineering departments, his name may already be very familiar because of the famous textbook, Felder's Elementary Principles of Chemical Processes. Next, what follows is a discussion with Professor Felder. Hello, Professor Felder. A very warm welcome to my small YouTube channel. A big thanks for agreeing to be here.
It's a pleasure for me to be here, Jivan.
Thank you. Thank you. So my first question has to do with a little bit of history, and I'm sure our student audience will appreciate it. So I've already mentioned your book, your famous book, Elementary Principles of Chemical Processes, but we are not going to discuss that. We are going to discuss teaching and learning, on which also you have written a book. I believe it was published in 2016, Teaching and Learning STEM. So you have written at the very beginning of your book, it would be unthinkable to allow people to practice a skilled profession without first being trained for it, especially if their mistakes could cause harm to others, unless they are college faculty members. So to drive home this point, you have given the examples of numerous professions, accountants, psychologists, and physicians who undergo years and years of supervised training before being actually allowed to practice on their own, but not college professors. They get the job, the college professor's job, based on the proficiency that they show in research, and then they're expected through some magic to turn that proficiency in research into a proficiency in teaching. So my question to you is, how did we end up in this situation? It's a weird situation, but it is what it is.
It's been that way ever since I was a student. Teachers, training for teaching in college is just something that has never been part of the preparation for the job, as far as I know. Now, maybe before I was born, before research was an expectation of faculty members at research universities, some training was provided, but I'm guessing no. I'm guessing that training in teaching was never provided at the college level, maybe with some exceptions of universities that take teaching very seriously and possibly that don't have strong research programs. And so the situation that we're in, you and say, good morning, Dr. So-and-so, we're delighted to have you with us at our university. We expect you to lot of good research and get grants and funding and so forth. And you're also going to be teaching a couple of courses. There's your office. Good luck. And that's maybe an exaggerated version of how short this training is, but it's not far off. And so the situation that we're in is that without any training in teaching, the only guidance we have is how our teachers taught us when we were college students, but nobody taught our teachers to teach either. And so it just perpetuates through the decades and centuries. I don't really have a good answer to the question of how did this happen, but the fact is that it happened, and it's unfortunate for students. And the example that you gave before, you can imagine doing this to a surgeon, for instance, telling you, welcome to our hospital. We're delighted to have you here. There's your office, and good luck. That would not end well. And in many cases, the same approach does not end well at universities.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit dramatic when we put it this way, but at least for the sake of the students who often wonder, why is it sometimes so very bad? There's the reason. We are not basically trained for it.
Yes, I think that plays a major role in it. The other thing is there's no guarantees either way. Some teachers, you could give them 4 years of training in teaching, and because of a lack of communication skills or a lack of interest in teaching, they may be primarily interested in their research, and that's really why they went into the college professor business. And so even with training, they might not be good. And conversely, despite the lack of training, there are some absolutely superb teachers out there. Most of us who have been college students can point to at least a few teachers who were just absolutely excellent. They were wonderful communicators. They were clearly interested in their students and in the quality of their teaching. And so even without training, they were naturally gifted in it. But the majority, I think, of professors would be considerably better as teachers if they were given some guidance before they jumped into the profession. And that's a lot of what I've been spending the last several decades of my career on, is trying to persuade college administrators that there are better ways of doing it, and that a lot is known about the learning process and the things that help make learning happen and the things that get in the way. And they're not, it's not rocket science. Many of these techniques that make a big difference in teaching can be taught and can be learned. And that, to me, is the rational way of approaching preparation for this profession.
Thank you, Professor Felder. And thank you especially for bringing up that point that at some point or another in our lives as faculty members, we were definitely influenced by some of our own teachers. So maybe they did not follow anything special, but just by their enthusiasm, just by their clear communication, and even just by the interest which always shows up, even if they're not trying, if they're really interested in teaching us, it somehow shows. And we get influenced by that. So I think I mentioned this to you over email before we started this conversation, that I was personally really influenced by one of our teachers here at IIT Kharagpur. And he is one of the main reasons that I decided that, okay, this might be a job I may do one day. So this was back in 2006, my 4th semester of my undergraduate days. I thought that, okay, I could perhaps do this job one day. I very much like to do this. And I have ended up doing that.
Jivan, you raise a really good point. Most of us are fortunate enough to be able to point to those handful of professors we had who were really good, clearly interested in us and our learning, and doing everything they possibly could to facilitate that learning. And that can have a profound effect. And that's one of the things that I love about this profession. is we have the potential to really excite our students and influence their direction in life. And that's one of the reasons that I would not consider going into any profession other than this one, is that
Absolutely,
potential
absolutely.
for influencing people.
Yes, yes. And actually, that is one of my most philosophical motivations for preparing this video. That I imagine and I believe that somewhere out there, there is a 20-year-old kid who will be heavily influenced and inspired by this video and maybe similar videos to this, and end up being much, much better teachers than I will ever be.
Hmm.
That
may or may not be true. That may or may not be true, Jivan. The fact that you're doing this, that you're clearly as interested as you are in this whole topic, suggests to me that in the future, at some time, you may be sitting where I'm sitting now and being interviewed by somebody in the generation after yours.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on. It is absolutely great that we have had teachers who, despite their lack of teaching, through their enthusiasm, have managed to influence us, have managed to enthuse us. But it doesn't change the fact that a lot of research has actually gone into teaching, into engineering education especially. You have been a pioneering figure in that. So for the sake of our audience who may not be at all aware of what you have been doing over the past few decades, could you please give us a very, very condensed, like orders of magnitude condensed overview of your work? I know, I mean, this could go on for hours and hours and probably days. So this is the most difficult question, but I request you, if possible, to condense it to a few sentences.
All right. That's as great a challenge as I think I've ever been presented with, but I'll give it my best shot. When you look at the literature on teaching and learning, and the book that my colleague Rebecca Brent and I wrote and published in 2016, sort of puts together a lot of the things that I learned by reading previous literature and from my own experience of trial and error of finding out what seems to work and what doesn't work. The couple of the main points that I learned and that I tried to put in the book and in papers that I've written. One is that probably the least effective method of teaching, and also common method of teaching, is straight lecturing. I get up and I talk at students for 50 or 75 minutes stretches, and they sit there and they listen, and maybe they might interrupt me to ask a question. Usually in a class that I'm teaching, there are 2 or 3 students who routinely ask all the questions, but they can do that. And most of the students are sort of sitting there passively, taking in information or not taking it in, as the case may be. And that does not cause learning to happen. And there's tons of research backing that up. People do not learn much, if they learn anything at all, by sitting and listening to somebody else tell them what they're supposed to know. The only way people learn in a meaningful way is by doing things. So I may talk for a little while on some point of engineering in the course that I'm teaching. And then instead of just continuing to talk for the rest of the 50 minutes, I might give a short example of something. And then I might say, all right, to the students, now you try it. And either I'll ask them to do something for a short period of time, maybe 2 minutes, maybe even less than that. All right, I've just given you an example of how to do a calculation. Here's a similar problem. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. See how far you can go in getting it started. All right, and sometimes I'll say, do it by yourself. And sometimes I'll say, turn to a neighbor or 2 neighbors, and I'll give you 2 minutes, see how far you can go in doing this. and then I turn them loose for the 2 minutes, however long I want to give them. And then I'll stop them and I'll say, okay, Joe, how did you two begin this? Susan, where would you go from here? And I'm getting them to tell me what they did. Two things happen when I do this, one of these short exercises. And this, incidentally, the name for this technique is active learning. It's getting students to do things for themselves in class rather than just listening to me the whole time. So some of these groups of, let's say, groups of two that have been working on this, in the 2 minutes I give them, do it. They figure it out, how to do it. And if they do it, they own it. They know how to do it because they did it. Other students will struggle for the 2 minutes and they won't get it. They didn't understand it sufficiently to the point where they could do it themselves. But now they know this is something I need to know how to do, and I don't know how to do it because the two of us tried and we were not able to do it in the 2 minutes. And so at this point, hands will go up. Professor, I didn't understand, where that number came from when you were doing this before, or I'm stuck. I can't figure this out, right? And at that point, I will answer the question. When those students leave, the 2 minutes of struggling that they did to try to do this led to either they're doing it or asking the right questions. When those students leave that classroom that day, they will know how to do that. Now, contrast that with the usual approach. I'm going through an example problem. You do this, and so on. And if I'm a good lecturer, everything looks clear. One step is following another. You do this, you do this, you do this. Okay, I understand that. And the students will leave the class that day and they'll think, oh man, that was a great lecture. I really understood that. Then they'll go home to try to solve a similar problem in a homework assignment, and they may struggle for 3.5 hours on that similar problem. Because when I'm doing it in class and they're watching me do it, everything looks clear. The hard parts, the easy parts, they all look straightforward. But there can be little points that look reasonable, but they don't really understand them. And it's only when they go home to try it themselves that they realize they didn't understand some of what I did. And that's the main, if I had to pick one point in what I've been trying to introduce my colleagues to in terms of teaching techniques, it's that the more you can get your students actively engaged in and out of class, the better they're going to learn. And if it's just you lecturing the entire time, if the students come back the next day and they don't seem to have been at the lecture, don't be too surprised. And I could go on for another 3.5 hours here with different points that I've made, but let's let it go at that one.
Thank you, Professor Felder. So I'm going to pull at a couple of points which you raised, and I'm really resisting the temptation to pull at all of them. Yeah. So you mentioned that if the lecturer happens to be a very good one, it can seem to be magically explained in the classroom, only for the students to be left confounded when they try, if they do even try to go over it themselves. And I think a very famous example of this, I remember having read somewhere that this used to happen in Professor Richard Feynman's class, because he was a brilliant orator, almost like a magician lecturer. So whatever seemed clear and absolutely perfectly understandable in his class seemed magically not understandable once the students tried it themselves.
Right. That's exactly the point that I was raising. Again, the theme of this is that people learn meaningfully in only one way, if it's non-trivial. If I'm just giving facts that can be simply memorized and then repeated, I can lecture, all right? And the students will just memorize the facts. But if something is conceptually difficult, which a lot in engineering is, or it's a very tricky calculation, or there's subtle little points that look obvious, but they're not at all obvious. The only way students are going to learn to do that is not by listening to me, but by trying it themselves, figuring it out, or getting feedback, then trying it again. And that's the point of active learning.
Uh,
No matter how good a lecturer you are, it's not
Absolutely.
sufficient.
Yeah. So pulling at another point from that little condensed version of your work, you have mentioned about the actual logistics of this active learning, where people discuss, where the students discuss amongst themselves in maybe pairs or triplets, things like this. So we do have, at least in theory, a system of tutorial sessions. We have it here in the IITs, and I'm sure in some of the other institutes of India also. And these were, at least the purported design of them was that we should have something on these lines. But truth be told, what we sometimes end up doing is that we steal from those tutorial sessions to lecture and to actually cover the syllabus. I have myself been guilty of this. But in the few,
So have I.
In the few tutorial sessions that we did have, especially for the second year and third year students, because I try to have these tutorial sessions religiously for the first year students. I never ever sacrifice that. If anything, I sacrifice a lecture or two to go into the tutorial sessions. And this is not something of my own doing. A senior professor actually suggested to me. And incidentally, he is the same professor who had inspired me to get into teaching and research and everything back in the day. So it's a full cycle. So I have actually noticed what you were pointing out, that when I lecture, I can see the happy faces of the students. But when I go into the tutorial session, there are a million tits and bits, which I myself as a lecturer would not have ever guessed to be a source of confusion among the students. So when I actually roam around in the class, like I actually literally roam around and run around in the class in the tutorial sessions, when I do that, you cannot imagine the kind of doubts that they come up with. And truth be told,
yes, I can.
Yeah, and I'm not ashamed to say this, that during those tutorial sessions, I think over the last 5-6 years, in a cumulative fashion, I think I have ended up learning more from them than probably they have from me. Because there are certain small things which I would probably never have emphasized during my lecture sessions. But because I got that implicit feedback from the students as they were working through the problems, that I learned that I needed to focus on those points during my lectures also. Because they seemed pretty obvious to me, but in reality, they were not.
That is the problem. Because once we've learned something, and if we're professors, generally speaking, especially after we've taught a course 2 or 3 times, we know that course very well.
Absolutely.
And it's easy to lose sight of what is going on in the minds of the students, and what seems obvious to us is not at all obvious to them.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's the point of the active learning again. You know, I keep repeating this, but this is, if you can only get one message from everything I'm saying here, if you're a student, especially if you're a faculty member, if you're teaching already, that would be the point. Get students actively engaged. Now, you have the tutorial system there, right, which I'm familiar with. In some cases in the United States, we have courses like that. Not all of them usually, but some of them, like the Introductory Chemical Engineering course at my university, North Carolina State University, has associated with it a tutorial session. And if somebody is teaching traditionally just lecturing in the lectures, and then the students go to a tutorial, I'd say probably 90% or more of the learning is taking place in the tutorials. The lecturer could just as easily videotape the lecture, and the students can watch it in the comfort of their own home. They won't learn very much that way either, but at least they'll be more comfortable than they would be in a traditional classroom. But the tutorial, if the tutorial is being run correctly, which means putting the students to work rather than just sitting through more lecture, that's where the learning is going to take place. And sometimes when I'm giving a workshop on teaching, somebody will raise the point that you did, saying that, well, I lecture in the lectures, but we have a tutorial session or a recitation or whatever it's called, all right? And so the students are getting their practice there. And my response to that is, look, you're spending 45 hours, more or less, with the students in the course of a semester lecturing, okay? And the students have the recitations and they're learning in the recitations. Wouldn't it make sense to take at least some of those 45 hours that we're spending lecturing to the students and have some learning taking place there too?
Absolutely.
And the answer is, well, of course it would, in which case we go back to active learning.
Right.
You know? You can cram as much information as you want to in a lecture, right? I could cover probably the whole textbook in one lecture, 50 minutes, if I put everything on PowerPoint slides and flash them like this during the class, and I'll cover the book. Will they learn anything? No, they won't learn anything because the human mind is limited in its information processing capacity. The brain can only take in so much information at a time, which means a very, very high percentage of that information that you're pouring out like that is never going to be absorbed by the students. So you're wasting your time, you're wasting their time. If you back off, don't try to present so much information and imagine that you've taught it, because you haven't. Focus on what is the most important information that I'm trying to present in this particular lecture. It's not all equally important. There are a lot of things which, if the students never saw them, it wouldn't hurt them. It's not going to be on the exam. You know, it's something that we think, well, it would be nice to expose them to it. But just exposure is relatively worthless as far as learning is concerned. And so if you're careful to focus on what is the critical information that I'm trying to present in this class today, and you make sure that you present that information and let the other stuff go or leave it for a reading or something of that sort. And then the critical information, you give the students an opportunity to do something with it, to try it, and then get feedback 2 minutes later. You're going to see a huge difference in what the students end up knowing. And you're going to see a huge difference in those recitations. Instead of just seeing the blank faces and the questions that they're now asking because they never had a chance to do it before, you're going to see students who understand something from those lectures. And now you can really put them to work in the tutorials to try more difficult problems, to have interesting discussions and so forth. It makes a huge difference in the nature of what you're doing as a professional.
Yeah, so in our native tongue, we have one saying which goes something like this. It's a rough translation. You eat less, but you eat well.
Oh, that's good. There's another saying. It's something, I don't remember it exactly, but you know, I hear and see and I forget. I do and I understand.
Yes.
Something to that effect.
Yes.
And that's like eating less but eating well.
Yeah. So moving on to the student's perspective. Now, in your extensive experience, and you've also elaborated on these points in your work, when you try to incorporate these kinds of active learning, you do face a lot of resistance from certain sections of students. Sometimes they are a little bit frustrated. In more extreme situations, they're almost hostile to your style, this newfangled style of teaching, where you call upon them to be actually not just physically present, but also be mentally awake in class. So how do you deal with such kind of resistance or hostile behavior?
There are several things. one thing I'll just issue a little corrective on is the notion that this is a newfangled idea, the idea of active learning. If you go back to the ancient Greeks,
Right.
if you read Plato and hear about Socrates' method of teaching, he was using active learning.
Absolutely.
Socrates was not lecturing, right? He was drawing out the points he wanted to make by asking whoever was sitting on the log opposite him, asking them questions and kind of guiding them to the understanding that they were supposed to have. In places in the Bible, there are references to the fact that people learn by doing. So it's hardly new, right? It's thousands of years old, this notion. But getting back to your question, yeah, there is resistance when you introduce active learning to students who are not accustomed to it. And there's also resistance from faculty members. I'll get back to the students in a minute, but many faculty members argue that, look, I'm the expert here. I'm the one who knows this stuff. My job is to transmit it to the students, and then it's their responsibility to learn it. And when I give workshops to teachers, which I've done hundreds of times, I always have to deal with arguments like that. In both cases, when I'm dealing with the students or when I'm dealing with the faculty, I turn to research. This is not an unresearched topic. There have been hundreds, no, thousands of research studies comparing the learning that results from straight lecturing, the traditional method of teaching, with the learning that results from the effective use of active learning. And the research data is overwhelming. For almost any learning objective that you want to look at, conceptual understanding, analytical method, problem solving, everything but just straight memorization of facts. The overwhelming evidence is that students learn more on average, much more in many cases, than they learn by just having somebody lecture at them. And I make that argument to the faculty that I'm talking to in the workshops that I give. And I make that same argument to the students. And when I first begin, on the first day of class, I have a little sermon that I give the students. And it goes something like this. All right, let me give you a preview of how this class is going to work. I'm going to be lecturing, but periodically during the lecture, I'm going to stop and I'm going to give you something to do, you collectively, the students in the class. Sometimes I'll ask you to do it individually, and sometimes I'll ask you to get into small groups and do it. And I'll give you a short period of time, could be 15 seconds, could be a minute. Rarely will it ever be more than 2 minutes to do what I'm asking you to do. And I'll describe what I want you to do, and then I'll turn you loose for however long I'm giving you, and then I'll stop you, and I'll call on some of you to share what you and your partner came up with. If you get it right, I'll congratulate you. If you get it wrong, if I can see anything rational about what you did, I'll say, okay, good, you're thinking about this, but you also have to consider that. And then I'll call on somebody else to provide it. And that's how this whole semester is going to go. Throughout the semester, this is the method I'm going to use. The reason I'm doing this, my little sermon goes on, is not to make your lives more difficult, to make you do the work that I'm supposed to be doing by telling you everything. The reason I'm doing this is because I have access to a ton of research showing that when students are taught in this manner, they learn more, they learn at a deeper level, and they get higher grades on the examinations that they're going to take on this material. That's why I'm going to be doing it this way. And my sermon concludes, I would be happy to share with any of you who are interested the research that backs me up, that says, Felder's telling you the truth here. Now, I will not live long enough for a student to ever accept that offer. I will never have a student say, yes, I want to see that research for myself and judge its validity and reliability. No, they're not going to do that.
That will be the
But
day.
the fact that I'm telling them, I've got the research, I'll share it with you, they will believe me. And they will sit still long enough to see that I really am telling them the truth. As much as they may not like this method the first few times I'm doing it, they are ending up learning more, and they'll realize this. And I've also got research proving that people have studied and written papers on students' resistance to active learning. And what they find is if it's done right, and there are right and wrong ways to do active learning, and I've written quite a bit about that too in the book that you mentioned and in papers. But the research shows that the resistance may be high at first, and then in a matter of a week or 2 weeks at most of active learning, the resistance generally disappears. All right, it's not a problem anymore. And the other thing that the research shows is that once the students have done active learning in one course, there's no more resistance ever. Next course that they get in, if the instructor is doing active learning and says on the first day of class, okay, get into groups now, the students just do it. Oh, okay, this again, and they're fine with it. So there is some initial resistance to active learning, but if you're doing active learning correctly, and if you let the students know, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it, the resistance just pretty much disappears as a problem.
So that last point you made, I think it's a fine segue to my next question to you, which I had a little discussion with you over email, and I was completely in the dark about this. So we have different kinds of students, right? We have introverted students, extroverted students, and anything in between. So I personally, I think I was a bit of an introvert. I found it difficult to talk with anybody and everybody. So my feeling was that if a professor back in, let's say, 2004, 2005 would have suddenly declared on the first day of class that from today onwards, we are going to do active learning in this course, I would have been a little bit scared, to put it mildly. The very fact that that I had left home for the first time in my life, left the protective environments of my school, and here I was all alone in a new institute, living in a hostel with my mates. Everything was new. The only last semblance of familiarity was in the lecture room, where the teacher would come and very authoritatively teach me. If that also fell away, now I would be in shatters. That was my feeling. So I told you that would it be perhaps better if, for the sake of the introverted students, selfishly speaking, that we perhaps introduce active learning a little bit later. So could you please recount, for the sake of, I'm sure there will be other introverted students who would be listening to this for their benefit, what you told me?
Sure. Well, the short answer to your question is no, would not be better to delay. The most important thing to me as a teacher is not making all my students happy. The most important thing to me as a teacher is learning. I want my students to learn the material I'm teaching them. It's very important to me that they learn. And if I have a technique which is going to promote learning, help them learn better prepare them for the examinations that I'm going to be giving them, then I want to take full advantage of that technique. And then I'll just bounce back to my previous answer. It does worry you. If you're an introvert, you're initially probably going to resist active learning to some extent. But the research on active learning that I quoted before was looking at the students as a body, introverts and extroverts alike. And what it found is that the resistance of both the introverts and the extroverts, the initial resistance of the introverts may be a little bit greater, but it's going to go away fairly quickly if you're doing active learning correctly, and the students are going to learn more. The other thing is you're, I suspect, exaggerating how bad you would feel as an introvert in finding yourselves being put into this. Where it would really be scary is if I'm making you get up and talk in front of the entire class. Even introverts are not all that uncomfortable talking to one or at most two other people in a small group for 2 minutes. Right? That's not going to terrify you, no matter how strong an introvert you are. And I can tell you, I may not be acting like an introvert now, but trust me, I am one. And I'm a very strong introvert in real life. The reason I may not seem like one now is because I'm a teacher. And what I found is that to be an effective teacher, I can't just be like that. I've got to get out there in front of the students, be connecting with them, transmitting information to them, listening to them if they have questions. And so even though I am an introvert in real life, I have to at least pretend to be an extrovert to be effective as a teacher. But if you're a student and a strong introvert, it's not going to be as terrifying as you're afraid of to find yourself being asked to do active learning. The other thing I'll briefly tell you about is I did a research study, 20 years ago or so, in which I followed a class, a chemical engineering class, through the curriculum, teaching them one core course, one required course a semester for 5 consecutive semesters, using all of the techniques that most of the techniques I talk about in the book, including active learning. And I surveyed those students. The object of the research study was to find out what will happen if you use these techniques repeatedly. Usually a student might see active learning in one class and then never see it again. My question was, what will happen if they keep seeing it? Would the benefits of this technique shown by the research be even greater if it's reinforced? And I did that, and I published quite a few papers on it. But one of the interesting things is I surveyed the students in every semester, asking them, how do you feel about these little activities that we're doing in class? Do you think they're helping your learning? Do you think they're hindering your learning? Or it doesn't make much difference, I can take them or leave them. And what I found is that in that first semester that I taught, and I asked the students this question right at the very beginning, in the first week of the course, I got a pretty good distribution, but the introverts, because I also had a way of determining who was introvert and who was extrovert, the introverts were more resistant. More of them didn't like these small groups than the extroverts, who thought, oh, this is great. I love talking to people and this gives me a chance to do it. But what I found was that later in the semester, 6 weeks into the semester, I asked the same question, and the resistance from everybody dropped considerably. And by the end of the sequence of courses, after they've been doing this for a couple of years, the introverts actually preferred the group activities to just lecturing to a greater extent than the extroverts did. And my theory about that is that the introverts realized that if they had been left given the choice, many of them would have said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to work by myself and so forth. But after they had done it for 3 semesters or so, realized that they were learning in these activities in a way that they had never before learned. And so they expressed an even stronger preference for active learning than the extroverts did. That both groups really liked it, but the introverts even more than the extroverts.
So thank you for pointing that out in such a nice, elaborate way. So regarding what I felt during my first year and what happened later on, I'll just say it for the benefit of the students who may be in a similar position as mine. So in my first year, I was an introvert. I stayed that way. And I saw all around me students who would bunch up in groups, study together. So although there was no active learning that was being actually done during the classes, but since we are in a residential campus, many of the students actually chose some sort of active learning in their own way. And
Yeah.
even though I stayed with my books much longer than they did better than me. So I'm a professor of mechanical engineering now, and people think that I have been an over-the-top excellent student all the while. It's not true. Okay, I didn't do as well as I should have, considering the fact that I was with my books all the time. I didn't do as well as I should have in my first year. But in my second year, I just took a cue from some of my friends and maybe opened up just a little bit. And I was very privileged to have a very good set of friends in my department. So when I roamed around with them, studied with them just a little bit more than my first year, my academic performance simply increased like a huge, it took a huge step forward. So there was not much difference in the teaching style, so to speak, from first year to second year, but it was a change in my attitude of me just consciously trying to open up a little bit that really helped me out a lot. So I think if we can do it from our own initiative as students, if the professor's input is there in terms of the active learning and the learning-centered teaching, it could be a huge boost to the whole spectrum of students. So I really believe that from an anecdotal perspective also.
Right. Now let me add something to what you just said, because what you just said is absolutely correct. I mean, you could see the benefit of working with other people, whether it was out of class or whether it was in class, you could see it. The fact of the matter is, though, for most people who go into the teaching profession, no matter where you are in the United States, in India, anywhere else, you've got to recognize that most of your students probably are not like you. You are one of those who finished undergraduate education, went on, got a doctorate, and went to teach at a first-rate university. You're teaching at an IIT, which are some of the best universities in the world. And you don't get into an IIT unless you're up here, generally speaking. Those really good students, they're going to learn with your help, without your help, despite you, if necessary. Most engineering students don't go on and get PhDs. Most of them don't go to IITs, right? And there is a huge dropout rate. I know you know this, it's common knowledge. People drop like flies out of general engineering programs. And if I'm a teacher and teaching at one of those universities, I feel an obligation to do everything I can, everything I've learned about what makes teaching effective, to try to help these students who basically have the capability of learning, but not necessarily all by themselves. I've got to use every effective teaching technique I know to make those students who have the basic ability to learn this stuff, to help them learn it. And so that's another argument for using active learning. Some students, again, will resist it, but more of them are going to learn and succeed and graduate, get their degrees, if I use these learner-centered techniques than if I just lectured. And so I consider that I have an ethical and moral obligation to do the best teaching I know how to do, to try to help those students who have the potential to do it succeed.
So thank you, Professor Felder, very much. So I know this little discussion that you just had wasn't part of our original plan of questions and answers, but really thank you very much for pointing this out, because a lot of the student viewers who take a look at my at my videos, they are not from the IITs, they are not from the NITs, the National Institutes of Technology. They are from some other colleges where they have certain challenges because of the circumstances, because of the quality of teaching overall, and different other things, like a million other things. So it's really it's going to be, I think, inspirational for many of them when they hear your words. And more than that, I think if anyone is listening from among our faculty colleagues from those institutes, it is my humble request to you to perhaps give this active learning, the learning centered teaching a try. It has been proven through research. There's a lot of support for it. And as scientists and engineers, we should believe the research.
Yeah.
And
Let me just add one thing to that advice, Jivan, which is excellent advice. Don't just go into class this coming Monday and start using active learning, all right? Because I've emphasized in everything I've been saying now that lots and lots of research shows that active learning done effectively leads to greater learning. But that done effectively is very important. There's some ineffective ways of doing active learning. And if you just jump in and start putting students to work in groups without first learning a little bit about what are the pitfalls, what should you not do when you're starting on this technique, you could not see the results that you're looking for. So before you launch into it, spend a little time researching it. Do what we've all been trained to do, is find out something about it. Now, I think the book that I wrote with my colleague, Rebecca Brent, is a good source of information. But there are many good teaching books and papers on these techniques. Find out a little bit about what are the pitfalls, what are the mistakes to avoid. Like, for instance, let me just give you one. You're going to do active learning, and so you come into class or the tutorial, and you say, "Okay, everybody, I want you to get into groups of 2 or 3, and I want you to solve this problem. I'll give you 20 minutes to do it. Go." Bad, right? Why is that a bad technique? One is because 2 things can happen when you do that, and you give them 20 minutes. The problem with that is 20 minutes is much too long for an active learning exercise. Some of the little groups in class of the top students will be able to solve it in 4 minutes. And now they're wasting 16 valuable minutes of class time talking about the football game or whatever it is they're doing. And class time is very valuable, both in a tutorial and in a lecture session. And you don't want 16 minutes to just be spent idly conversing because you finished with the problem. Other groups, maybe the students are not quite as good, will struggle for the entire 20 minutes trying to figure this thing out, and they won't be able to do it. That is also a supreme waste of class time. Not much learning is going on after the first 2 or 3 minutes of that struggle. And so what's really important in active learning is to keep the activities short and focused. So you don't say, take 20 minutes and solve this problem. What you say is, I want you to take 1 minute, see how far you can get in getting this problem solution started. Go. And now again, you stop them after a minute, you're getting answers from them, what they did, and you're filling in anything that they miss. And then if the next part of the problem is totally straightforward, you can just quickly lecture through it. Simple algebra, they know how to do that. And then you get to the next difficult or challenging part, and maybe now it's 2 minutes. Okay, now go back, see how far you can get in solving this part of the problem. That back and forth like that is what makes active learning work, what makes it effective. And those brief struggles are the most important part of it. So research active learning a little bit before you do it. And other techniques that we can talk about here, it's the same thing. Don't just do it. Find out a little bit about how and how not to do it, then get started. You probably won't get it right on the first day you try it. Like everything else you do, it takes practice. but it won't take you too long before you really start to become effective at it.
Yeah, so pulling on that point which you mentioned regarding if you read up a little bit of active learning, you will learn quite a few things, but then don't just try to implement all of them next Monday. And I think you mentioned this over email that it's not a good idea to expect yourself to undergo a personality transplant to just engage in active learning. We are faculty members, but we are also fundamentally human beings, flesh and blood. We have our own personality limitations. So probably keep that in mind also.
Yeah. When I give the teaching workshops to faculty, they generally last a day and a half, 2 days, and sometimes a couple of hours. But at the end of one of the long workshops, like a 2-day workshop, my final speech before I let them all go, it goes like this. Okay, look, in the last 2 days, I've presented you with 187 different teaching techniques with a strong recommendation for all of them, that this will help your students' learning. Then I say what you just said, Jivan. I said, the message I'm giving you is not do all 187 of them starting next Monday. That's a prescription for failure, right? You can't you'll be doing too many new things all at once. You won't be confident in your ability to do this. You're going to start getting resistance from some of the students. And if you try to do all that new stuff, you're going to get a lot of resistance from the students. And you're going to decide after that experience, I'm never going to want to do this again. I'm going to go back to lecturing. The message I'm giving you is take 1 or 2 of those 187 techniques and try those and give them a fair try. Don't just try active learning once and tell the students to get into groups and do something and they just look at you like you must be kidding. It's going to take some getting used to for both them and for you. So try it a few times so that the students start becoming accustomed to it. And if it's working, keep doing it. If it's not working after you've given it a fair try, then stop doing it. Next semester, next course you teach, go back and pick another 1 or 2 techniques. Try them. If they work, keep doing them. If they don't, then stop doing them. And if you do this, I'll give you a guarantee. Your teaching is just going to start getting better. And it's going to keep getting better, because if a technique is not making your teaching better, you're not going to keep doing it. And so the one thing you can guarantee if you do this is the course you teach this semester is going to be better than the same course when you taught it last semester or last year. And you're going to steadily increase as you keep adding more and more of these techniques. And that's all you need to do. You're never going to reach perfection, right? But if you make steady progress, your courses are getting better and better, the students are learning more and more, you win. That's all you need to do. And that's all you have to worry about doing.
Right. We strive for our personal best every time.
Yes. And our personal best, if we keep striving, we'll keep getting better.
Exactly. All right. So this is another thing on the positive side. Let me go back to being a little bit negative. So we know for a fact that sometimes because of the circumstances, because of administrative constraints, or there are a million other things which may be hindering professors from taking up this active learning, at least en masse. Now, for students of such institutes, is there any hope for them to perhaps engage in some sort of active learning? So it may be a little bit of a contentious question, but if you could just discuss this.
Sure. And you've already answered that question yourself, Jivan, when you described your introversion. Yes. And your fear of active learning. And then you discovered that studying with other students outside class helped you.
Yes,
It helped your
absolutely.
learning.
Absolutely.
You were doing active learning, right? The
And I think,
difference is you were doing it on your own. You were doing it on your own. You were working with other students, sharing ideas, figuring out things together. And this one doesn't see it, but that one figures it out. And now you both know it. That's exactly what active learning does. And one thing that you can do is encourage your students to do that,
right.
right? If you're teaching this course. Active learning, I want as much learning as possible to take place. So I want to use my class as a time when the students are working together. But that doesn't mean they don't carry it outside class. And if they're taking from a teacher who doesn't use active learning, it becomes all the more important for them to get into these small groups and teach each other outside class.
And I think it helps matters a lot, even if there is one teacher who is somehow able to introduce this entire aspect of active learning, because once the students are exposed to it, even if their other teachers are not doing it, perhaps they can carry over those learnings, those styles of learning to other courses also on their own.
Right. All I can say in response to that is I completely agree. I couldn't put it better myself.
Yeah. So I'd like to raise one very important point which you have mentioned yourself during our email communications. It is that what does cognitive science tell us about how STEM students, students of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, should study for exams, how it hurts them, and what's the best way to study?
Okay. One thing, and this is relatively recent that this has gotten into the literature, but the typical way that most STEM students study is probably the worst way that they can study. Here's the usual preparation for examinations. The student looks over old tests and looks at the answers, the solutions that were put up on the board outside the classroom, and just reads over them and says, oh, okay, I do this, I do this, I do this. Oh, that's clear. I understand that. And it said this next problem, I do this, this, and this. And they go through the old exams like that. They look at solutions to homework problems that they've done in the past. And they maybe reread the textbook, just looking through it again. Why is that a bad technique? Because what cognitive science has found, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but what does learning mean? What is learning? Its definition cognitively is taking in information and storing it in long-term memory in your brain, and then subsequently retrieving it when you need it, like on the exam. And what the cognitive scientists have found is that retrieval is not automatic. The fact that something is in your long-term memory, it'll stay there forever, but that doesn't mean you can bring it back out when you need it, like on the exam. And what the scientists have found is that what facilitates retrieval, subsequent retrieval, is previous retrieval. When I first learn something, when I first get it into my long-term memory, if I try to remember it in a week, the chances are, if I've only seen it once, the chances are good that I won't remember it, right? And if I learn it in class and I don't see it again until the exam 6 weeks later, the chances are very good that I won't be able to retrieve it. It's in there, but I can't get it back out to put it on the exam. So what facilitates subsequent retrieval? It's prior retrieval. The more you retrieve a piece of information, the easier it's going to be to retrieve it subsequently, like on the exam. Okay? And so what's the problem with that traditional method of studying, which is rereading old solutions and things like that? You're not retrieving it when you do that. You're just casting your eyes over it and expecting something useful to happen, which it probably won't. So that's not a good way to study. What is a good way to study It's to retrieve the information. Force yourself to retrieve the information. Like, here's an old problem on an exam, or here's a problem out of the textbook or out of a homework assignment. If I just look at the solution, it's not going to help me. What I need to do is try to solve that problem by myself without looking at anything. Just work it out myself. If I can do it, that means I've retrieved it. That means the chances are good I'll be able to retrieve it again or something similar to it on the exam. If I try retrieving it, solving the problem by myself without looking back at anything, chances are good I'll get stuck, all right? What I do then is I go back now and look at the solution and see where I got stuck and see how I would proceed from there. Then I put the problem away and I go on to look at something, another problem that I'm going to try to solve. Then an hour later or a day later or 2 days later, I go back and I try to solve that problem again without looking at anything. Now the chances are much, much better that I'm going to be able to do it. And if I study, if I test myself like this and try to solve it without looking back at anything, I'm going to be ready for that exam. And the chances are much, much better that I'm going to get a good grade on it than if I just use the usual method of rereading things. If there's factual information, definitions that I've got to memorize, or here's a diagram. This is a biology class, and here's a diagram of the human body with all of the different parts labeled. The way I'm going to study for that, if I'm a traditional student studying, is I'll look at that diagram again. Okay, that's the liver, that's the spleen, and so on. And then I'll put it away and go on to something else. I haven't retrieved the information from my long-term memory. I've just looked at it again. So now what I do is I make flashcards for myself and I test myself on them. Or I'll put the diagram there without any of the labels on it, and I'll try to put in the labels myself. And again, I'm retrieving it from long-term memory. I keep doing that as much as I need to. And again, now I'm going to do better on the test than I would if I studied in the traditional way. Students don't know that. That's relatively new information, but they can help themselves tremendously by just getting that little information about how the brain works into their long-term memory.
So, Professor Felder, what you just mentioned has actually triggered some old memories of what I did during my 4th year. So, what happened was that by the time I was in my 4th year, I was completely familiar with the system here. And I had grown quite confident. So confident even that I got into some bad habits of studying. So by this time, I was no longer an introvert. At least I had gotten over the issues associated with it. Now, what happened was that the way that I started studying was that before the exams, maybe 1 week before the exams, I used to sit down with the books and the notes and somehow used to swallow them whole. Now, I ended up getting very good grades. But what happened was that later on, some of these coursework material actually came, I had to use them during my PhD work. And when I was trying to apply those things, I realized that basically I did not remember, or more importantly, I had not really understood what I had studied and gotten excellent grades on. So this retrieval problem, and not just retrieval, like fundamentally understanding something is completely different from just getting a good grade in an examination. Contrasted to this, what I probably studied in my 2nd year, especially in my 4th semester, there was one course, and I did not do any similar course to that later on, but still somehow I remember doing, I remember some of the things because I struggled through the problem sheet so much during the course, all throughout the semester.
The key to active learning is that, or studying for an examination, and you're trying to solve these problems for yourself without looking at the solutions. It's difficult, but it's a desirable difficulty because that struggling is what's going to lead to the subsequent learning and understanding to the point where you're able to do something similar on the exams. And so trying to make everything easy. Now, it's easy to reread things like old problem solutions. You just do it, cast your eyes over it, and imagine you're doing something useful, which you're probably not. But those struggles that you just described that you were having when you were studying for these difficult examinations were what led to your subsequent good performance and your high grades on the tests and on in the courses.
Right. Okay, Professor Felder, I want to bring up a point which may not be of that much use to our undergraduate students, but I think there are quite a few PhD students who do view my channel, and some postdoc students also, postdoctoral researchers, and some faculty members, some early career faculty members. So for their sake, I would like you to kindly touch upon that eternal tension between investing time or dividing time between teaching and research.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so from the point of view of faculty members, if you're teaching at an institution that has a strong research expectation, and I'm not that familiar with the system in India, whether you have the same system for promotion and tenure there that we have here.
So at the IITs, we have a system which is heavily, which heavily rewards research achievements. If you are bad at teaching, it may create problems, but it will probably not absolutely hinder your growth. But if you're bad at research, then bye-bye career.
Okay, we have exactly the same system in the United States as you just described in India. And so you've got
this is in the IITs. There are certain institutes, very good institutes, like top-notch institutes in terms of undergraduate training. They encourage people to invest a lot of time on teaching. There are institutes like that.
All right, let me answer that question by describing a little bit about my career. So I started somewhere in the late Jurassic period is when I first became a faculty member. And so I'm there at North Carolina State University, which is a top-notch university with a very high research expectation. It's exactly the way you just described the IITs. They really expect you to excel in research, to get the grants, to write the papers in the top journals and so forth. And you could be in trouble if you're not able to do that in terms of remaining a faculty member at that institution. And they also want you to be a good teacher, right? But if you're doing all of the research very well, and you're doing an adequate job of teaching, they're not marching to the dean demanding your removal, for instance, because your teaching is so bad, you'll probably do fine. So what I discovered, I had no training in teaching beforehand, like everyone else. And I was considered a decent lecturer, but I was making a lot of mistakes. All right, the students liked my lectures, but I was getting fairly low grades on the exams from my students. And so clearly I wasn't doing the kind of teaching job that I would have liked to do. I learned by trial and error, as we do. I got better at teaching. And I started maybe 10 years into my career discovering that there was such a thing as learner-centered teaching and some of the active learning, some of these other things. But I still did the research and kept that as a top priority for myself. And I moved up the academic ladder. I got promoted from assistant professor to associate, then from associate professor to full professor, and I even got a named professor. And I was doing the research and doing it well. I was succeeding at it. I was getting the grants. I was publishing the papers. About 10 to 15 years into my career, I took stock of where I was in my career, and I admitted to myself finally, I'd sort of known it all along, but I finally admitted to myself that I liked the research. I enjoyed doing the research and I was succeeding at it. I loved the teaching. Nothing gave me as much satisfaction in the research that I was doing as I got from really the teaching going well. Could see light bulbs going on over students' heads as they grasped difficult concepts, and they did well. They started off maybe getting a low grade on the first exam, but they just kept getting better and better as they were learning. And that gave me more satisfaction than anything I was doing in research. And I was now a full professor. And if my colleagues or my department head didn't like what I was doing, the worst that they could do to me was deny me my 0.5% merit raise, and I could live with that. And so at that point, I stopped doing technical research. I focused on my teaching, and I was also still doing research, but it was research on education, research on teaching and learning. And I had a wonderful, satisfying, happy career for the rest of my career. Now, if I had tried to do that in my first year, or in my first 3 years, switching away from the technical research, focusing entirely on teaching, it would not have ended well. So you got to be aware of what is the incentive and reward system at your university if you're teaching. If research is what's rewarded and teaching is in second place, still do what you can. There's a lot of simple things you can do in teaching that can have a big impact on the students. But if something is going to require a huge investment of your time to adopt, then maybe you want to hold off on that. Stick with the simple but effective teaching methods and focus on your research as much as you need to. And then if you get tenure to the point where you have a secure position at the university, now it's up to you. If you want to continue focusing on your research and just do an adequate job of teaching, fine, do that. If you want to change your priority and focus more on your teaching, less on the technical research, at that point you can do that. If you want to maintain a good balance, which is probably the best option for most faculty members, then you do that. It becomes up to you. But as long as it's not entirely under your control, you've got to work within the system that you're working in.
Thank you, Professor Felder. So I'll try to remember that as a very personal advice also. When you mentioned about the very simple and effective things one can do, when I was going through your book, I noticed something as simple but very critical as learning objectives, specifying the learning objectives at the outset. So could you perhaps mention that? We do not have to sacrifice anything from our research to do that in our coursework.
Okay, so let's define what a learning objective is. Let's start by saying what a learning objective is not. A learning objective is not a statement of, here's what I'm going to teach you. A learning objective is not even a statement of, here's what I want you to learn. So what is a learning objective? A learning objective is a statement of, if I'm successful at teaching you what I want you to learn, here's what you should be able to do to demonstrate that you've learned it. Here are the kinds of problems that I expect you to be able to solve. Here are the kinds of things I expect you to be able to do in a laboratory, and so on. So it's a statement of, here are the things that students should be able to do to demonstrate that they have gained the knowledge, mastered the skills that I'm trying to impart to them in this course. And once you start formulating those, it changes everything about your teaching. Right? Once you've formulated your learning objectives, you use them to dictate everything you're doing in the course. What you cover in class, what you put on the assignments, the homework assignments, what you put on the exams, the kinds of activities that you do during class and active learning, everything about that course follows from the learning objectives. And what that does is you end up teaching a really coherent course. You don't do this sort of thing where you teach this and you do something else on the homework assignments, and then you put things on exams which are different from what you did during the class and so forth. Everything is pointing to the same knowledge and skills. And it sounds straightforward, but it changes teaching and learning completely when you use learning objectives to dictate everything you're doing in that course. And that's something that most faculty members who aren't familiar with the literature and with these learner-centered methods don't do. You know, most professors write their syllabus. We're going to cover this, 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 and this, and then they're done. And that leads to things like teaching this and then testing on something else, which is utterly pointless. But if you're using learning objectives correctly, that doesn't happen. The whole course is coherent. And so if I were naming two things of everything we cover in the workshop and everything we cover in that book, that I would say, if you don't do anything else we're recommending, do this. One, active learning, and two, the formulation and systematic use of learning objectives to dictate everything that goes on in that course. And that will get you a long way toward where you want to go to make your teaching as effective as it possibly can be.
Thank you, Professor Felder. On the point of learning objectives on how to write them down, I was actually a little bit surprised to see you very clearly mentioning not to use words like to understand this and that, to appreciate this and that. So those are no-goes. That's
Right.
not really a learning objective.
Right.
Yeah, I
Okay.
have been more personally guilty of statements like that in my learning objectives, but I will correct them.
You and everyone else.
Yeah.
All right. So what's wrong with, we have what we call the 4 forbidden words, words that should not appear in the learning objectives. The students will know this, will learn this, will appreciate this, or will understand this. What's wrong with those words? What's wrong with them is that they're not observable. I cannot see a student understanding something. I would never write an exam which says to the students, problem 3, understand this. It would be meaningless. In order to know whether or not, let me give you a concrete example. In the Introductory Chemical Engineering course that I teach and for which I wrote the textbook that a lot of people use, one of the things that we cover is the ideal gas equation of state, familiarly called the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT.
Yeah.
All right, so I could tell you that in this course that I'm teaching, one of my objectives, one of my goals is for my students to understand the ideal gas equation. You could then turn around and tell me, well, okay, that seems like a worthwhile goal. How will you know whether or not they do? And there are several things I might answer in response to that. I might say, well, I'll give them a temperature and a pressure and ask them to calculate the volume of the gas. Or I'll give them conditions of a gas, temperature and pressure. And I'll ask them, for this combination of T and P, would the ideal gas law be a good approximation? Right? Explain. Or I might say, well, I'll ask the students to derive the ideal gas equation of state, right, from the kinetic theory of gases. Whatever I tell you, you would then tell me, good, those are your learning objectives for the general goal of understanding the ideal gas equation. The only way I can know whether or not a student understands something is to ask them to do something that requires that understanding. And then I can look at what they do, it's observable, and I can judge, Do they understand the ideal gas law or not? Did they do that correctly or not? And so the key characteristic of learning objectives is that it has to be observable. It has to be something you can either see the students doing or see the results of the student having done it. The other characteristic, required characteristic of a learning objective is that it must be clear to the students.
Yes.
When a student reads one of my learning objectives, they can say, all right, the learning objective is for me to derive the equation of state. Do I know how to do that? If I do, good. I'll go on to the next objective and see if I know how to do that one. If I don't, if I'm not sure how to derive that equation, that says I better go back in there and learn it. Because clearly I'm going to need to know how to do, I might need to know how to do that on the exam that's coming up. So observable learning objectives give students the information that they need to know, is this something I need to study or I don't need to worry about it? And for that reason, it must be clear to the student. If I give an objective to the student and the student says, what does that mean? Clearly, it's not going to help anyone. But if my objectives are observable, it's something that the instructor can see that the student either knows or doesn't know how to do, and it's clear to the student, then it's a good objective. And now if a student says, I don't understand that objective on the study guide, now it's up to me to change the statement of the objective to something that the students will all know. Yeah, I know how to do that, or I don't know how to do that, and I better find out.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong. So this sounds, this kind of a philosophy behind formulating the learning objectives, it seems to echo Professor Karl Popper's theory of falsifiability. I don't know if I'm remembering it correctly. So he said that a theory can be good or great depending on whether you can actually falsify it through experiments. So.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a beautiful analogy. It can be falsified. Yeah, that's true of a theory. And the key is clarity, right? If a theory cannot be falsified, you can't prove that it's wrong. You also can't prove that it's right under those circumstances. And it's not much good to anybody. A learning objective is only valuable if it gives the professor the basis for judging whether or not a student has learned something, whether it's been effective teaching, and it gives the student guidance in knowing what they need to study. Without observability and clarity, it's not a useful objective.
All right. So we are coming to the last question now of this discussion. So this is somewhat of an idealistic question, maybe a little bit hopeful, a bit too optimistic maybe. But all throughout these last 2 years, during the pandemic years, when we have been taking up measures to impart online education, at least some of us who have spent a lot of effort and time, and I know I have actually sacrificed time from my own research on teaching this, because I was completely at my wit's end on how to do this. I didn't know anything about online teaching. I literally started learning about online teaching maybe from the month of April 2020, and really started learning it about how to handle anything, even the technological things, how to handle it, starting from maybe July or August 2020, as a bit of a late starter in this. But eventually, I think I managed to do an honest job of it. My students will be the best judges of it. But in the process, I have also learned some things which were missing from my offline teaching also. So this it's not just the infusion of technology in our teaching, but through the infusion of technology in our teaching, certain bits which are actually missing in the whole philosophy of how we taught. So maybe in this critical juncture of history, when we are going back to offline classes, to some semblance of normalcy that we had before the pandemic, do you think it would be a good idea to maybe, even if gradually, think of infusing very consciously, not as a forceful measure, technology enhanced active learning? Well, I'm waiting
Yes,
for a yes from you.
you got it. No, I mean, that's a critically important question. And it's one that practically all of this profession have been wrestling with now for 2 years. You know, about the time you started worrying about active learning, April of 2020, is when I and most of my colleagues started worrying about it. And we were gradually moving up the learning curve, the way we learned how to teach offline in the traditional mode. You didn't start out by doing it well. You started out by making a lot of mistakes and learning from them and gradually getting better and better. And the same thing is true of online education. I'll say a couple of things about that. One, I consider two aspects of teaching to be critically important in online education. Do you have any idea of what those two things might be? I've given hints about it in this presentation. Okay.
No.
One, learning objectives.
Oh.
Two, active learning. Teaching is teaching, whether you're doing it the way we're communicating now to each other, or whether you're doing it in a traditional live classroom, or whether it's a hybrid, you're doing some of this and some of that. There are advantages to one of these environments and disadvantages, and conversely for the other environment. There are some things that you can do better online than you can in a traditional mode. Let's just consider lecture, all right? Straight lecture. I get up and give a lecture in a class, and I'm traditional. I'm talking at the students for 50 minutes or 75 minutes, and they're listening, and maybe they're asking questions. Maybe they're just sitting there passively receiving information. Maybe they're not even passively receiving information. They're focusing more on the cell phone, which is in their lap, that they're busy texting a friend or whatever may be going on. All right. So that's the traditional approach. The online approach is now, instead of giving a lecture in a classroom to students, I videotape the lecture. All right. And the students watch the taped lecture in the comfort of their own home or dormitory room or wherever there is. I'm going to argue that the not much learning is going to happen either way, right? Because it's a straight lecture. There's no active involvement. There's no desirable difficulty. It's just passive reception of information. But I'm guessing that the online approach is going to be more effective than the traditional lecture approach. Why? Because the student has some control in the online environment. If I say something which is incomprehensible to the student, just flies right past them, they can stop,
Yes.
rewind, play it again. And they can do that as many times as they need to until it either becomes clear to them or they have a question that they can formulate and send to the professor in whatever mode of communication they have. Or if the professor is having office hours online, then the student can bring that question to the professor. Whereas in a lecture, straight lecture, the professor is just talking, the information just flies by, and if it's not understood, the student cannot ask the professor to stop and rewind and repeat it again. There's some advantages to the live class. I mean, in a live class, the student can raise their hand and stop me and ask a question. Although if I'm looking at 150 students in this class, very few students would do that.
Exactly.
All right. But if they're watching it on a videotape, they can go back and forth as often as they want. So there's some things you can do better online, some things you can do better. The optimal approach is hybrid. You do online the things that are best done online. You do face-to-face the things that are best done that way, and you've got the best of all possible worlds. Now, active learning objectives, it doesn't matter whether it's online or face-to-face. You just formulate your learning objectives, use them to design your assignments and exams and so forth. Active learning, it's not quite as obvious how to do it online, but there are ways to do it. If it's a synchronous class, you have these breakout rooms. You can do the same thing that you could do in a face-to-face class. Stop the lecture, get the students into small groups using breakout rooms or whatever it is, and do active learning. If it's asynchronous, it's not quite as obvious how you would do it, but you can organize students in your asynchronous class into study groups, all right? Have them communicate, get online with each other and work out problems in their group. And again, you can do some things better this way, some things better that way. If you learn the technology, if you learn how to get students actively engaged, and in the last year, I've co-authored 2 papers on exactly that. One of them in Advances in Engineering Education, the other one in the International Journal of Engineering Education on getting students, getting active engagement online. If you take the time to learn some of those techniques, read the papers, and then start putting it to work the same way you've always done in your face-to-face class, you're going to be doing very good teaching in either environment.
Thank you, Professor Felder. So I think what you have suggested, we can make it work even during the offline classes. So hopefully, God willing, from next autumn semester or fall semester, we are going to go back to our actual classes, everyone, hopefully, big hope.
Right.
So I think even if we do lecture, I think it would be a good idea to anyway record some of the more important parts of the lecture and share them with the students, because there is always this facility of pausing, maybe slowing down, thinking, and then at least I personally like this way. For the few courses that we had those video lectures, it was absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I have one suggestion for you. Do that in the next course you teach. Do exactly that. Introduce online supplements to whatever you're doing in the traditional classroom, and do it enough that you feel confident you've got a handle on it,
right,
that you're doing it reasonably well, that it's helping the students. And when you get to that point, write a paper about it and share that knowledge with the rest of us on faculties so that they can take advantage of your insight and your experience in doing this.
That's a wonderful idea. Why didn't I think of it? All right. So I think we are at an end. Let me just check if I've missed any important points. I think I have not. I have a million other personal questions to go through. I wish I could borrow your brain for an entire day. But I think we have covered what we planned to cover, and it has been wonderful, absolutely, like fabulously wonderful talking to you. I really hope that the few teachers who do view my channel will find some value and meaning in it. But more importantly, my eternal wish is that there'll be some kid out there who will feel sufficiently motivated to take up this beautiful job that we have.
I share that wish completely with you. And thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.